Hello and welcome to Tech Deals System Performance Comparison, 4 different desktop computers. We are testing 4 PCs here at 4 different price points, $400, $500, $600, and $700. What kind of performance can you get for the money? I have previously done videos on each of these computers linked in the video description below. Really briefly, the $400 PC has an i5-2400 processor, 16 gigs of DDR3 1333, and an EVGA GeForce GTX 1060 3GB superclock graphics card. You can put that together for about $400. The $500 PC is a custom build with the 7th generation Intel Pentium G4560. This is actually the only 2-core chip in this test. 16 gigabytes of DDR4 2400 with a RX 470 4GB graphics card. The third computer is also a custom build, AMD's FX-8300 CPU running at 4.2 GHz. Yes, that's overclocked. 16 gigabytes of DDR3 2133 and the MSI Gaming X RX 480. Finally, that leads us to our last system, the $700 Acer Aspire T desktop computer with the Intel i5-7400 CPU, 16 gigs of DDR4 2133, and the EVGA GeForce GTX 1060 6GB superclock graphics card. Now, as I said before, the full playlist of all these computers will be linked in the video description below. That'll be 4 separate playlists because I reviewed each of these machines separately. But I'm putting these together because the price points are reasonably close and many people have asked me to compare the relative performance of these computers. The new Pentium G4560 versus the FX-8300 versus what you can get with a pre-built i5, either a 6-year-old one or the brand new one in the case of the Acer Aspire. Now, we are currently watching the Pentium G4560. If you look in the upper left-hand corner, you will see the real-time performance numbers from MSI Afterburner. Third line down, you'll see G4560 right there, and on the very top line, you'll see our RX 470 graphics card. Now, to be honest with you, I was very surprised by the performance. I did not expect a 2-core, 4-thread CPU with an RX 470 to do this well. We are playing Battlefield 1 today at 1080p Full HD resolution at high detail preset. And we're getting 100 frames a second out of it. And 100 smooth frames. It's not just the frame rate. Take a look at our frame time. We have very, very good performance. This is smooth as silk. I genuinely am surprised. Now, it's using everything the computer's got. Take a look at our CPU usage, basically 100%. Take a look at our graphics card usage, also 100%, so there's nothing left in reserve. It's also worth noting we're not in combat at the moment. We're just running across the field. You'll notice that the frame rate's already starting to drop. It does dip when the combat gets heavy, so don't think that you're going to get 75 frames per second when there's 5 enemies on the screen and lots is going on. I'm running to the battle at the moment. Now, for the record, I have tried Battlefield 1 on the older Pentium dual-core only chip, the G4400, completely unplayable in all respects. You absolutely have to have 4 threads, but the fact that this is playable on a 2-core chip, even with hyperthreading, impressed me greatly. Now, at the end of this video, I am going to have charts showing minimum, maximum, and average game performance, and I'll talk about my opinions of the playability of these. In other words, what do I recommend for AAA gaming in 2017? Do I actually think you should go out and build a new 2-core machine from scratch in 2017? You can see here that the frame rate has now briefly dipped below 60 frames a second. Okay, it's come back up to 70, but there have been several spots where it dipped below 60 frames per second, and it will dip lower than that depending upon where you're at. It matters what map you're on, how many players are in it. Now, we're in multiplayer. Why? Well, because the campaign plays fine. The campaign is not stressful. If you really want to see Battlefield 1 stressed, you've got to be in multiplayer. So if you came here wanting to know, well, how does the single-player game play? It's fine. There's nothing to worry about. It's really the multiplayer that really stresses your computer. Alright, enough of the G4560. How about the AMD FX-8300? Now, this is an interesting machine. I just built this a few months ago, and I've got a whole series of videos on it. It's a $600 custom-built machine with an 8-core FX-8300, but it's worth noting that the FX chips are actually quite old in design. This processor first came out in its original form in the beginning of 2012, so this is in fact a 5-year-old design. It's been been refreshed and updated over the years, but it is in fact really still a 5-year-old design. What makes this really interesting is the fact that it is now low enough in price to still be worth considering. You can now buy a brand new FX-8300 processor for under $100 for a chip that will run at over 4 GHz with 8 threads for under $100. That just might be the deal among all these machines. The only caveat I will add to that is while it has 8 threads, none of them are particularly great. The single-threaded or single-core performance of this processor is by far the worst here, only slightly behind the i5-2400, which would be the second slowest in terms of single-thread performance. I would like to point out that this is only going to be true for a short period of time because Ryzen 5 is just around the corner. I'm actually recording this voiceover on April 4th. April 11 is when Ryzen 5 launches. Now, these game performance videos were actually recorded back in March. I waited until I had enough together on these 4 machines to produce this, but I'm actually doing this voiceover on April 4. And if you're watching it between April 4 and April 11, it might be worth considering just waiting for Ryzen 5, to be totally honest with you. The short version as to why is simply this. Ryzen 5 is going to have at least 8 threads. Some of them have 12. Now, it is not as highly clocked as the FX-8300 is. The clock speed will not be up in the 4.2 plus gigahertz range, but the instructions per clock cycle, the efficiency of the chip is much, much better. So, undisputably, Ryzen 5 will be faster in all respects to the FX-8300. It will, however, cost more, at least $170 for the base R5-1400 chip, plus about $80 for a motherboard, versus under $100 for this processor and $60 to $70 for the motherboard. Alright, enough chip analysis for the time being. Not to worry, I will test all of these machines again, or at least I'll test Ryzen 5 and compare it to these results when I can publish benchmarks. Look for those April 11. Looking at our real-time performance numbers from MSI Afterburner, you can see that our graphics chip is completely and totally utilized. We are running at 100% utilization. You can see the fans turning, although not that badly. This MSI Gaming X graphics card is an awesome card. It runs reasonable in temperatures. The fan hardly turns. It makes basically zero noise. That fan speed and that fan size make no noise. It's running at a factory overclock just over 1300 megahertz. I love that card. It's very, very nice. Now, our FX-8300 is in fact using 6 of its 8 threads right now. We're up just under 75%. 100% is all 8 threads, 50% is 4 threads, so 75% is 6 threads. Now, it does spread that work across all of them. The Windows scheduler rotates that, so it's not just using 6 of your threads, but what it does mean is that there is some spare performance on the chip. Battlefield 1 is one of the new crop of games that absolutely will use more than 4 threads if you have them. In the Intel side, that would be an i7 something. On the AMD side, that's either the FX-8300 series or the new upcoming Ryzen 5 or the existing Ryzen 7 chips. Take a look at our frame rate. It's really, really good. The 8 threads here, and this is the only 8-thread chip in this test here, really make a difference in this game. It is noticeably smoother than the last one, and you'll see that when you see the results at the end of this video. Moving on from the FX-8300, we now go down to the least expensive machine here, the $400 i5-2400. Now, this particular machine you're looking at here is a Dell Optiplex. This is a pre-built that I picked up off of eBay for under $150. Wait a minute, you say? You said it was $400. Well, sure, we dropped a $200 graphics card and some RAM in it. That raises the price. But it is worth noting that you can pick up i5-2400 and some of the slightly newer i5-3450s or 3470s. Those are 3rd gen Ivy Bridge. If you can find them for around $150 or less, by all means get an i5-3450 or 3470 if you can find one. But the bulk of these machines on eBay are going to be 2400s. And what's impressive about the i5-2400 is it's the first of the truly modern era of Intel processors. Everything they've made sense, up to and including the i5-7400 you'll see later in this video, are all just derivatives of each other. The 2400, the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, they're very similar chips with similar designs, architectures, core counts, memory cache counts, the chipset architectures for the motherboards, they got refined over the years. They added features such as M2 slots and USB, better USB support. But the reality is a brand new B250 chipset is not actually that far off from what this computer originally shipped with 6 years ago. And just to be absolutely clear on that, I do mean 6, and actually more than 6 years ago. The i5-2400 launched in January of 2011. Here we are in 2017 playing Battlefield 1 at 60 frames per second with a $200 graphics card installed. That's pretty cool. Alright, with all these explosions you notice the frame rate has dipped a little bit, but that's going to happen. However, it's still completely playable. Look at those frame times. We're not really going over 20 milliseconds on our frame times. It is incredibly smooth. To be completely honest, I suspect there's been some Battlefield optimizations going on here, because when Battlefield 1 launched, I remember it being choppier on 4-core processors than it is today. I remember comparing the i5s to the i7s back a year ago when Battlefield 1 launched and going, man, this game really needs an i7. It's so much smoother. Except, wait a minute, why in the world are we smoothly at 60 plus, over 60 frames a second there with reasonable frame times? Yes, they do jump over 20 milliseconds at times. This computer will be by far the worst in terms of frame time consistency, but it's not that bad. Everything is relative. It is amazingly good for the fact that you can put this together for $400, including the 16 gigs of RAM, and play Battlefield 1? Holy smokes, what a deal! There is one thing I would like to call attention to. System RAM usage. Take a look at line 4 in our real-time performance. We're using over 12 gigs of RAM. If you watch the RAM usage in Battlefield 1 on the other 3 computers, it's not that high. In fact, none of them go over 10. Now you might say, well, why didn't you close all your background tasks? Why do you have stuff running? I don't. This is a test machine. This computer has a completely clean install of Windows 10 on it. I bought this, put an SSD in, did a completely clean install of Windows 10, put the games on here, and tested it. There's nothing else running on this machine. In fact, all 4 of these computers are test machines. None of these are personal machines. None of these get played with by my kids or me. We don't sit here and use them for anything. They sit on the shelf. All 4 of them right now are all sitting on the same table next to each other across the room. Why in the world this computer has over 12 gigabytes of RAM allocated when the others don't? I actually don't have an answer to that at the moment. I have seen this behavior in other tests that I have run. Grand Theft Auto 5 showed the same thing, and it's been pretty consistent that this i5 machine simply uses far more RAM than the other ones. Is it the fact that it's an i5-2400? Is it the fact that it is a Dell Optiplex old business machine pre-built? I don't know. One possibility is I might do a clean reinstall at some point and see if these RAM numbers hold, but in looking at the task manager, I don't really see anything that's using all of that RAM. Sometimes if you open Windows Task Manager, you'll see 1 or 2 programs just chewing through the RAM like crazy. On this one, you don't. So I'll be honest, that's a bit of a mystery. In any case, leaving that mystery behind, let's go take a look at the most expensive machine in our list, the i5-7400. Now this is a $450 pre-built machine with several upgrades added. The RAM has been upgraded to 16 and a $240 graphics card has been added. Now in the past, I didn't used to recommend the 6GB version of the GTX 1060. That advice has been changing. A few points. Number 1, when the 1060 launched, there was a $60 price difference between the 3 and the 6 gig version. There's now a $40 price difference. So the fact that there has been a substantial price reduction in terms of relative cost between the 2 cards is why that's starting to change. The other factor is when these cards came out in the summer of 2016, fewer games really used that much VRAM. That is starting to change. I'm starting to see a larger number of games come out that on ultra detail will absolutely use the RAM. That being said, even Battlefield 1, which is known to use lots of VRAM, is only using 3.1 gigabytes. So while we have 6 gigs of RAM, it isn't using it at high detail. At Ultra, it would use more, but at Ultra, the performance wouldn't be as good. And for that reason, if you have a 3GB 1060, don't feel bad. Yeah, you'll probably have to play your games at high instead of ultra, but to be honest, as new games come out through the end of 2017 and into early 2018, you probably won't be able to run them at ultra on either 1060 anyway. Not because of VRAM limitations, but performance limitations. As new games come out that are more demanding, you'll have to scale it down to high and then slowly scale it back to medium, so your VRAM will be less of an issue anyway. That being said, for a $40 difference and a 10% performance increase, I think the 6GB card is now worth considering, especially if you're buying a new machine. If you're going to go out and spend $450 on a brand new i5, sure, go ahead and get the 6GB version. If you're going to spend $150 and buy a 6-year-old i5 off of eBay, save the money. You probably aren't going to use that extra VRAM on a 6-year-old PC anyway, so just save your money and get the 3GB version. One point that's inevitably going to come up is the fact that why do two of these machines have RX 470 and 480 AMD cards and the other two machines have 1060 NVIDIA graphics cards? Great question, glad you asked. First things first, the simple reality is the RX 470 and 480 cards do not physically fit into the Dell Optiplex and the Acer Aspire machine. The drive cages are in the way, the cases aren't large enough. Those machines weren't designed for these cards, and these cards are physically bigger and longer than the GTX cards. They also draw more power. Now, I did not upgrade the power supplies of either of the i5 machines. We are running on the power supplies that both machines came with, and we're using Molex adapter cables to run the two GTX 1060 cards. For all the people who have watched my i5-7400 Acer Aspire review when I did the upgrade video, all of which is linked in the video description below, there must have been 10 different people who said, "Whoa, hey, you can't really do that. I thought you had to have 400 watts to run a 1060. No, you don't. I know, if you actually go to NVIDIA's website, it'll say recommended 400 watt power supply for the GTX 1060. Seriously? Well, they're covering their back ends, and I understand that. Here's the reality. I have a real-time power meter connected to the wall where this tower is plugged in. This exact machine, while I was running these tests, never pulled more than 200 watts from the wall. Taking into account power loss efficiencies, that means this computer was never really using more than about 160 watts of electricity. Nearly half of its 300 watt power supply. We aren't even close to the limit. The fact of the matter is, you don't need to replace the power supply. You aren't anywhere near the power limits of a 300 watt power supply with a GTX 1060 graphics card. So that's size issues. The second issue is I have had very hit or miss luck using RX cards in general in pre-built machines. Custom build machines? Awesome. They work perfect every single time. On a dollars to performance basis, the RX 470 and 480 are the deal. They are the best deal in graphics cards in the market today. If you have a custom built machine and you want a 1080p graphics card, 470 or 480 is absolutely the way to go, no doubt about it. You can now find RX 470 cards in the $130 to $150 price range. That is an amazing value for the money, if it works in your computer. I have tried installing various RX cards in pre-builts. I've even changed it around and messed around with the cases. I've put RX 460s into the ones that the 470 and 480 wouldn't fit. Nothing but trouble. My recommendation is if you have a OEM Tier 1 machine from Acer, Dell, HP, Lenovo, get a GTX card. The RX cards are more trouble than they're worth. And of course, I've said this in other videos, and people consistently want to say, but what if I use this, or what if I use this one? Yeah, do whatever you want. I'm telling you from experience, because I own a dozen of these things, it's more trouble than it's worth. Now, if you have a custom build machine, get the RX cards. They are spectacular. One final point about custom versus pre-built. Pre-built is referring to OEM machines from Tier 1 companies such as Acer and Dell and HP. I am not talking about iBuyPower and CyberPower, who build machines with off-the-shelf components. The $720 CyberPower machine that I've recommended endlessly, and is in still fact the best deal on the market in my opinion, absolutely runs flawlessly with the RX 480 that comes with it, because they use off-the-shelf motherboards, they use off-the-shelf power supplies, normal components you would buy yourself. That was kind of a cool jump. So this only applies to the pre-builts from the major big companies that have all custom parts. Have you seen enough Battlefield 1 yet? Yeah, I know, I kind of talked for a while, but yeah, hey, I had a lot to say. Not to worry, the next 3 games tested will be much shorter videos. Now we are in World of Warships. We are back on the Pentium G4560. Take a look at the graphics card usage and the CPU usage, and you will notice that the CPU usage is very low, although it will pick up later. You will notice that the graphics card usage is all over the place. That is because the RX cards work different than the GTX cards. If they are not fully in demand, their usage bounces between fully used and partially used and somewhere in between. The NVIDIA cards tend to clock themselves down and stay at a more fixed percentage, and you'll see that later in the video. Now, the first thing you might say is, great, we must be CPU bound. If our graphics card is not completely occupied, then our CPU is terrible. Not really. Here's the thing I've discovered about World of Warships, and to be honest with you, I didn't know this when I first started testing it, but I have learned it since. The game itself limits you to 75 frames per second. There's an internal limiter that basically says, yeah, we're just not going to run faster than 75 frames a second to give you a nice, smooth experience. There is a file in the game directory you can edit. I have played around with it, it does work. Except, every time there's a new patch to the game, they reverse it. And so you're constantly having to edit the game file and put the settings back. Now, I'm not going to detail what that is here, but that is why the CPU and the GPU are sitting around bored, because the game simply won't run beyond 75 frames per second without editing the game's files. Now, I am going to show you brief snippets of this game on each card, but here's the short version. All of these machines play World of Warships just fine. And having said that, we'll transition to the FX-8300 because I do want to get through these and try to keep this from being an hour-long video like the last one of these 4 machine comparison videos was. Here we are on the FX-8300, the RX 480. We're stuck at 75 frames per second because the computer has nothing to do. This is going to be true even in fairly heavy combat situations. There are moments where it will drop, and I'll show you those drops in the charts at the end of the video. They are very few and far between. Now, I did record several games on each of these because, frankly, World of Warships is a game I don't just play for benchmarking, but I play for fun. A lot of these games I really only play for Battlefield 1, for example. I know I'm terrible at it. I play that for benchmarking purposes only. I don't fire that up to play it otherwise. As a side note, if you've never played World of Warships before, free-to-play game, link in the video description below. By all means, go download it and give it a try. There are hundreds of ships that you can unlock and play completely for free all the way to the end of the game. Let me be clear, this is not a pay-to-win game. Yes, there's a cash shop. Yes, there's premium ships. Yes, there's premium consumables. Yes, there's a premium subscription, but the top tier, best in class ships in the game are all earned, and you never have to pay a penny to get them. The very best chips you can buy with real money are 2 full tiers below the very best chips in the game. So don't think that you just buy your way to power and will dominate. In fact, if you try this game out, don't buy the top-end chips when you first start. You won't know how to use them, and you'll just get blown up endlessly. You do have to learn some skills working your way up through the ranks. So download it, play it for free. There's no point in spending any money the first dozen or so hours you play the game. All the early ships in the early tiers you unlock will come so fast. Don't spend any money. Enjoy the game for about 10 or 15 hours. If you still like it and want to keep ranking up, then consider spending some money in the cash shop if you really want to. But the fact of the matter is, the majority of people play this without spending a dime, and it is an absolute blast. I don't want this to turn into a World of Warships review, but boy, this game I spend way too many hours in. And speaking of way too many hours and proof of that, here is the i5-2400. Take a look at the ship I'm in. This is the Tier 9 German battleship. You earn this by playing the game. You cannot buy your way into this ship, well, other than a subscription, which does get you credits and experience a bit faster. You will have hundreds of hours into this game before you get to this ship. I love this ship. The secondaries are awesome. The smaller secondary support battery guns, they auto-fire at enemies that get too close to you. I'm actually quite a fan of the German battleships. The Tier 10 American Montana is also a lot of fun, although it citadels a little easily, but you know, it is what it is. Take a look at our graphics card usage, 35%, nothing. You could put a GTX 1050 in here and it would run exactly the same because we are limited, actually in this case, by the CPU. Take a look at our frame rate. I will take a minute to talk about this one because we are in fact on a 6-year-old computer. We are not graphics card limited, we are CPU limited. We're currently using 3 of our 4 cores. We're at about 75% usage right there. Main system RAM usage is fine, graphics card usage is trivial, the VRAM on the graphics card is trivial. We are nearly a full gigabyte beneath the maximum VRAM, but the graphics card is bored because the CPU can't feed it. This is one example of a situation where the graphics card is bottlenecked by the CPU, or buy less graphics card, or buy more CPU. Having said that, this is a good example of the problem with the question, will X bottleneck Y? And I see it asked all the time in comments. Will a 1060 bottleneck a i5 this? Will an i5 this bottleneck that graphics card? You can't ask that question. You're asking the wrong question because the answer is always, every single time, it depends. In what? Playing what? At what resolution? The GTX 1060 is basically bottlenecked by the i5-2400 in World of Warships at 1080p at high detail. Set it to 1440p at very high detail, and that situation may very well change. It may reverse, and it may be the graphics card limiting it. Likewise, in Battlefield 1, the GTX 1060 wasn't remotely bottlenecked by the CPU. They were both running at basically 100%. So when you ask the question, will this card bottleneck that CPU, or will this CPU bottleneck this card, you are asking the wrong question. What you need to be asking is, what hardware do I need to play the games that I want to play at the resolutions that I want to play them at? Now, that's never going to have a simple answer, and everybody wants a simple, easy answer. Sorry, there isn't one. If you want to play World of Warships, you want something newer than an i5-2400 in my opinion. This plays fine and it's absolutely playable, and actually I did pretty well in this match. Now that I'm watching the Citadels, ouch, blew the enemy up 2 straight Citadels, devastating strike, obliterated that poor cruiser. Now that I'm watching this replay, I'm remembering it because I recorded this a couple weeks ago. I didn't have any problems playing it on this machine, but I've played this game a lot, and after a while, you get used to playing the game. But if you're learning the game, being frame rate limited can be eternally frustrating. In any case, you get the idea. It's not ideal, but it is in fact completely playable. Speaking of which, I actually have the settings on this one. Speaking of the Tier 10 Montana, if you doubt how many hours I have into this game, that is a grind. This is the top of the line Tier 10 battleship in the American line, and yes, it takes a lot of hours of grinding to get to, even if you are subscribed with a premium account in this game. To be completely honest, that's no great loss. If you try to enter Tier 10 matches with this ship and you really don't know what you're doing, you'll just get blown up endlessly because the people at this end of the game know what they're doing. Start at the beginning, work your way up, you will gain the skills to do well. Now take a look at our frame rate. No issues whatsoever. The CPU's loafing along with 2 cores being used 50%. Our graphics card's loafing with nothing to do whatsoever, using 2 gigabytes of VRAM. As I said before, you could play this game on a GTX 1050 at 1080p and you would have no issues. In fact, I often do. My i5-7400, which is my daughter's computer, has a 2 gigabyte GTX 1050 in it. On the weekends when I play World of Warships with my kids, you can put 3 people in a division. My 6-year-old son and my 11-year-old son often play with me. I sit at my daughter's computer because all 3 machines are in our dining room area. They're all next to each other, so all of us can just sit and talk and spend some father-son time together. Now, I play on the weakest of the 3 machines. My son actually has the older CyberPower machine with the RX 480, and that's my older son, and my younger son has a GTX 1060. So, dear old dad is playing with a 1050. Guess what? 60 plus frames per second, never an issue, 1080p, high detail, no complaints. So anybody who thinks you have to spend a fortune to have a lot of fun, you don't. Here's a free-to-play game with a nearly unlimited number of hours of playtime that you can play on very modest hardware. Side note for any parents in the room concerned about why I let my minor children play an online game, these computers are all next to each other, and I don't let them type in chat, and they're not allowed to play unless I'm sitting there. So I'm like literally 3 feet away from both of them. That's the only time I let them do it, because otherwise, you know, the internet and bad people online. In any case, go check out World of Warships. It is way too much fun. Moving on to Tomb Raider, or in this case, Rise of the Tomb Raider. Now, this is the first level in the game. Rise of the Tomb Raider has a built-in benchmark. I am not a fan of built-in benchmarks. Having said that, Mankind Divided later in this video, which is the fourth game I'm testing, is the built-in benchmark. Why? I don't have enough time in that game to reasonably be able to record in-game benchmarks. Testing and benchmarking lots of games takes a lot of time, and loading all these up and finding a place to test them absolutely is a huge time sink. Ideally, I would never run a built-in benchmark. I play the game. Now, I have in the past done the built-in benchmark for Rise of the Tomb Raider, but what I've found is that from machine to machine, you can get fairly inconsistent results. I have not found them to be as repeatable as I care for them to be. Playing this first mission is incredibly repeatable. Now, this first mission is not the most challenging mission in the game. Keep in mind that later in the game, frame rates will drop. And I want you to note that even right now, we are using every bit of our graphics card. That RX 470 is completely and totally utilized. Our CPU, on the other hand, is not. Our CPU is loafing along with hardly anything to do. Now, that will also change later in the game, but it's worth noting that even right now, we are in fact completely graphics card limited. So you could say that the RX 470 is in fact bottlenecking a dual-core Pentium G4560, at least at this point. More graphics card would get more frame rate. Still, we're at 70 frames per second, which is completely and totally playable. But when you get into the vegetation areas of the game, that's when that's going to fall apart. So do I really recommend a dual-core machine with an RX 470 to play Rise of the Tomb Raider at high detail? Not really. Now, you could turn it down to medium and you'd fix a lot of those problems. Speaking of medium detail and performance, take a look at our VRAM usage. We're at 1.9 gigabytes of VRAM. Now, likewise, when you get into the vegetation areas, that will go up. You'll go up to about 2.5, about 2.7 at medium to high detail. This is why the 4 gigabytes or even 3 gigabytes of VRAM is enough. You run out of graphics card performance before you can put it up to very high detail. In fact, if you run this at very high detail on an RX 470, the performance tanks, and it's just at various parts later in the vegetation areas, it's completely unacceptable. So you are going to have to run at high and maybe lower it to medium when you get into the vegetation areas. I am now going to trim for time, and we're going to jump to the FX-8300. That's not all I recorded. I recorded that whole first mission, climbing up the mountain, going through the cave, going around the ice, but I'm trimming it because I'm trying to keep this from being another hour-long 4-machine comparison video like the last one was that started with Grand Theft Auto 5. I mentioned before that the links in the video descriptions below will take you to the 4 playlists of this machine. You will also find the other game performance videos in those playlists. The previous one had started off with Grand Theft Auto 5 and then tested 3 more games, World of Tanks and others. I will have another game performance coming up after this that includes Overwatch and 3 more games. I already have all 12 games tested, but I'm spacing them out because otherwise if you watch these back to back, well, it might be boring. This is a great opportunity to bring up the whole graphics card thing, RX 480. Now, the RX 480 is in general about 10% faster than a 470. So if you can get a 480 for about 10% more than a 470 and you want to boost in performance, do so. I wouldn't necessarily recommend spending 20 or 25% more because you're only getting 10% more performance. They are basically the same card, it's just the number of shaders that are on the card. Otherwise, everything is pretty similar. Now, the VRAM speeds and some of the configurations, and of course the clock speed of the chips can vary whether you get a factory overclock card or a non-factory overclock card. But that being said, the general performance difference between a 470 and a 480 is about 10%. The same, by the way, is true of the 3GB and the 6GB version of the GTX 1060, which is why I'm starting to recommend the 6GB card a little bit more. When they were $60 apart, I didn't think it was such a good deal. But keep in mind that for a $40 price difference, not only are you getting 6GB of VRAM instead of 3, you're also getting a card that runs 10% faster. There are more CUDA cores on the 6GB version of the card. So for a $30 to $40 difference, yeah, okay, fine, buy the 6GB card. For a $60 or more difference, nah, it's not really worth the money. That's kind of also where that recommendation change occurred. Take a look at our real-time frame rate. We are playing Rise of the Tomb Raider at 1080p at high detail preset with anti-aliasing turned on, mind you. Anti-aliasing was turned on for all of these Rise of the Tomb Raider runs, as well as in Battlefield 1. It was off in World of Warships. And we are getting over 70 frames per second. Please note, this is on a 5-year-old CPU design. Okay, it's a refreshed version of the 8100 change series, the 8300, but the reality is the whole FX series is about 5 years old, and the fact that this plays as well as it does demonstrates how well the FX series has aged. I have noticed that the i5-2400s, which are in fact an incredible deal for the price they're going for on eBay, do have lower minimum frame rates than the FX-8300 in many modern games. These FX-8300s have aged very, very well, and I have to admit to being impressed by this machine that I built a few months ago. Well, we're nearing the end. Let's take a look at the i5-2400. Now, the initial frame rate here is great because there's nothing on the screen. Give it a second. We're on the GTX 1060 3GB card, and you will notice that it's basically at 100% usage. Now, you actually can't play this at very high detail, not with acceptable frame rates, because very high detail in this game does require more than 3 gigs of VRAM. That being said, the GTX 1060 doesn't really have the horsepower to play at very high detail at 1080p, so it's really a moot point. Even if you buy the 6 gig version of this card, when you get into the forested areas, the jungle areas, you're not going to get 60 frames per second consistently out of either of the 1060 cards. So it's, yeah, it is what it is. But if you really want perfection and very high detail, you actually really need a GTX 1070, believe it or not. Main system RAM usage here, just like with the other tests, is higher than on the other machines. I mentioned this during the Battlefield 1 test. I'll just briefly point it out here again. We are at over 9 gigabytes of main system RAM usage. Again, that's unique to this particular machine. It's a clean, fresh install. There's nothing on it. Go figure. I might at some point figure out why, but it is what it is. You can see that our CPU is loafing along, basically using only 2 of its cores. Now that will peak up at various points. There's nothing in Rise of the Tomb Raider that requires more than 4 cores or 4 threads. Yeah, it's nice to have more, but really this is an example of a game that really doesn't need more than 4. There are exceptions, yeah, Battlefield 1 of course, but there are others coming too. This plays fine, it really does. In the interests of expediency, let's trim this out and jump to the i5-7400, our $700 Acer Aspire T pre-built desktop with the 6 gig GTX 1060. Will this have the highest frame rate of all of our computers today? Of course it will. It's the most expensive machine. I certainly hope so. We are still using, however, 100% of our graphics card. See that 98%, 99% up there? Take a look at the clock speed of our graphics card. These NVIDIA cards are amazing. GPU boost, auto overclocking. These cards do not come at 2 gigahertz out of the box. It's just worth pointing that out. I have not manually overclocked them. This is NVIDIA's GPU Boost 3.0 at work. It is auto overclocking itself to 2 gigahertz. In fact, all of the 1060s will do that, at least every one that I have, and I've tested about a half a dozen of these cards, actually a little more than that, I think 7 of them now. They all run at about 2 gigahertz without complaint. Now these are single fan cards installed in a basic pre-built machine. Look at the temps. The CPU is nothing. I mean, look at that, 44 degrees Celsius for a CPU, that's trivial. Now for the graphics card, it's at 71 degrees C. Now that's warm, but it's well within normal operating parameters. Anything under 80 or 85 is just fine. It's nothing to worry about. Now you'll see that the fan speed is faster than the RX cards. We're at 1600 RPM. But remember, there's only one fan on these cards. The RX 470 and 480 are both 2-fan cards, so it has to turn its one fan faster than the 2-fan cards to get the same level of cooling. Now you might say, well then why didn't you put a 2-fan card into the i5 machines? They don't fit. Again, remember, we are very space limited. Would I buy a 2-fan card if I didn't have a space issue? No, it's completely irrelevant. There's nothing wrong with the performance, and you're not going to run any faster with the 2 fans. The fans will turn slower, but you have twice as many of them. Will the chips run cooler? A little bit. I did a video where I showed that. The updated 2017 GTX 1060, which card should you buy? I actually tested them. I ran them all through. I recorded the temperatures and the fan speeds. Yes, of course. An Asus Republic of Gamers Strix GTX 1060 graphics card with 3 fans not only turns them slowly, many times they don't turn at all, even while gaming. Some of the gameplay that I recorded on that GTX 1060 with 3 fans, they weren't turning. Why? Because they actually put the same cooler on that card that comes on the 1080. It is way overcooled and over-engineered for the 1060. It's also more expensive. Is it worth the money? Yeah, I don't think so. But if you want a fancy RGB build, because it has RGB lights on it, if you like the triple fan cooler, knock yourself out. But frankly, I think these superclocks are the ones to buy at the 1060 level. Now, I am going to trim this here, and we're going to jump into the mankind divided benchmarks. Those are the built-in benchmarks up front DirectX 12. They're all the same, and so you're going to be watching the numbers. I'm going to put some music on so you can take a break from listening to me talk. When all 4 cards have played through the game's built-in benchmark, we'll be back with all of the results.
I just hope Trinity hasn't beaten us to it.
And here we are at the results. To make a long story short, all four of these computers averaged over 60 frames per second, 1080p, high detail in Battlefield 1. That's remarkable. I was not actually expecting the G4560 to do that. Having said that, it's worth looking at the minimum frame rates. 41 frames per second on the G4560 and 37 frames per second minimum on the i5-2400, and you see one of the deficiencies of those two platforms. The 6-year-old i5-2400 with only 4 cores and 4 threads and the lower instructions per clock cycle of that processor really held it back in various places. The G4560 is a much more efficient and faster chip, but it only has 2 cores, so anytime serious stuff was going on, it also was held back. The AMD FX-8300 with a minimum of 54 did wonderfully. In fact, look at the average frame rates. i5-7400, 7th generation, latest and greatest i5 from Intel, performed almost exactly the same as the 5-year-old designed FX-8300, 92 and 92 average, 54 and 55 minimum, which is essentially a tie. However, look at the maximum frame rates. The FX-8300 beat out the i5-7400. Now that's only a couple of frames. The max is not a big deal, but the fact that the average and the minimum were so consistent demonstrates how well the FX-8300 has aged over time. When that i5-2400 came out and when the FX-8300 came out, the Sandy Bridge, the i5, was a much better processor for the games of its day. The Sandy Bridge, the Intel chip, was a better processor. However, fast forward 5 or 6 years later and you will find the FX-8300 soundly beats it. Having said all this, I would like to point out what's not here, either Ryzen 7 or the Intel i7s. This just goes to show that to play games at 1080p, you don't need any of them. You really don't. The entire argument that's currently going on with the whole Ryzen 7 launch and the Intel i7, which should you buy for gaming, what's the best? At 1080p resolution at high detail in a new game such as Battlefield 1, you clearly don't need any of them. These chips run fine. That being said, the deal, I believe, is going to be either a Ryzen 5 1500X or a 1600 in terms of price to performance and getting a computer that will still be good 5 years from now. I do think all of these machines will start to age over time, and I wouldn't want to own any of them 5 years from now. The next game we tested was World of Warships. High detail preset 1080p. Take a look at the performance. Overall, very, very good. Now, the i5-2400, as I mentioned during the gameplay, was CPU limited, and that's why you see its average frame rate down at 54 frames per second. The minimum was also down there at 38, but then again, so was the i5-7400. In fact, notice that the 3 4-thread processors are all right around 40 frames per second minimum, yet the 8-thread FX-8300 held 10 frames per second better. That FX-8300 is a beast and a great value for the money if you want to custom build a machine and for whatever reason aren't ready to go with Ryzen 5 when it launches in about a week. I do wish to be absolutely clear here. This is all CPU limitations right here. None of these games were remotely graphics card limited. So what you're seeing here is the purest form of the processor limitations, not the graphics cards, because the graphics cards played no part in these performance limits. It was all CPU. That brings us to our fourth game, Rise of the Tomb Raider 1080p high detail preset. This is a much more predictable set of charts. The G4560 is the weakest chip here. It does not have the lowest clock speed, but it does in fact only have 2 cores, and it has the slowest graphics card here. And this test was ultimately graphics card bound. While the World of Warships test was all CPU limits, this is entirely graphics card limited. It is worth noting that on a clock-for-clock basis, the G4560 is a faster processor in single and dual-core applications than the i5-2400 is. The clock speed's higher, the instructions per clock cycle is higher, it's a better chip. However, the RX 470 is slower than the GTX 1060, which is why you see the gap. They were all playable. Please note that you're going to have to turn the details down to medium in the vegetation-rich areas of the game on any of these machines. Having said that, you will notice that the best machine here also had the fastest graphics card. The GTX 1060 6GB card is the fastest graphics card here. It is probably 5 to 10% faster than an RX 480, and it's on a better, more modern processor. The i5-7400 makes a bit of a difference here because we are, in fact, only using about 2 of our 4 cores, so the 8 threads on the FX-8300 does not make a serious difference. However, do not get carried away by saying that the i5-7400 is some superior gaming chip to the FX. We were graphics card limited. Throw a GTX 1070 into all of these machines and the results would be dramatically different. That brings us to our final test, Mankind Divided DirectX 12 built-in benchmark. Now, this is the purest form of a test because, of course, they are exactly identical. What's interesting is the average frame rate of the FX-8300 is identical to the i5-7400, 65 frames per second. But look at the minimums. The minimums are where you're really going to see a difference. Now, the FX-8300 is a great chip, but we don't need 8 threads for this game, at least not for the benchmark, and that's where the superior instructions per clock cycle of that i5-7400 really shines. The nice graphics card doesn't hurt either, but that also, the CPU does make a difference there. The G4560, very competitive, right in line with an i5-2400. Coming back to the Battlefield 1 results, I simply want to make one overall statement. The fact of the matter is, to play modern games at 1080p resolution at high detail does not require top-of-the-line processors from anybody. Now, sure, the minimum frame rates on the older machines and the dual-core machines are lower. Take a look at the i5-7400, 55 frames per second, average frame rate on a basic $450 pre-built with a basic $240 graphics card dropped into it. That's incredible, and it just goes to show you how modest of a computer you can start with and still have amazing gaming performance at an average of 92 frames per second. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with that big huge subscribe button directly below. Post your comments below the video, and as always, check out the video description. That's where all the good stuff is. First of all, links to Amazon to buy all of the parts, and the pre-built Acer Aspire computer will be down there. The link to eBay to buy the i5-2400 series machines. The links to all 4 playlists will be down there as well. And then finally, my Patreon link will be down there. Do you like my videos? Was this interesting and informative? Do you like my analysis? Do you want to see more? Then click that link and go support me on Patreon. I would greatly appreciate it. $1, $5, anything you can give is greatly appreciated and will be used to make more videos for you. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.